So here we go. Book of Ezekiel. Are you excited for this one? After 38 and 39, you're probably like, please no. No Ezekiel, please, no Ezekiel. This is a crazy book. It really is, and it's probably one of those that gets skipped over a lot. I don't know, have you ever heard a pastor preach on Ezekiel in a church? Now, this is not to kick any pastors. Obviously, I wouldn't want to do that, but Ezekiel is a tough book. And so most people don't spend a lot of time with Ezekiel because it's a tough book. And so I think it's really well suited for a class. That's why we're going to do it, because we can talk about it and get into the weeds of it a little bit. But there's some stuff in here that's really interesting, and it's really hard to understand because Ezekiel does some really weird stuff. And so, we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit as we go through this stuff. So that's where we're going to get started, and we're going to kind of start with talking about a little refresher. We talked a little bit about this when we did 38 and 39, but what was the world like during Ezekiel's day? What was the world that he was doing this in? Because we kind of forget the context, or we just don't pay attention to it. We just think it's this guy who was a prophet, and he got these weird visions, and strange stuff. But what was the world like during Ezekiel's day? So what was going on? Exiled to Babylon. That's right. So where's Ezekiel at when he gets these visions? Is he in Jerusalem? No, he's in Babylon. Okay, so just to kind of give us a little kind of recap, I guess, a little bit, maybe not if you're just kind of joining for this particular class, but they have been exiled. Okay, so Babylon has come in and invaded. There's been some battles that have been fought, and essentially they have taken over this region here. And so I wanted to show you the Babylonian Empire. Now, this is when Nebuchadnezzar was the king. Okay, and you can see they had a pretty big area. But here's Babylon over here. They came in, they had a battle up here with the Egyptians. Jeremiah talks quite a bit about this particular battle with the Egyptians. And then coming down here, they came in and they invaded and came into Jerusalem and took over a good portion of that. Now, during Ezekiel's day, Ezekiel gets taken out of Israel and sent to Babylon. Where did they put him? Did they put him right here? In Babylon, where did they put him? They put him actually over here. There's a place called there's a canal over there that they basically settled a bunch of Jews next to, and that's where they put him, and a small group of the exiles. Okay, so he's not necessarily living in like downtown metropolitan Babylon, okay? He's kind of in an area by Nippur where they have him and a bunch of other exiles living, okay? So kind of a timeline. Let me just give you a little timeline of this. So in 605 BC, this is when Nebuchadnezzar is king in Babylon. He goes and attacks Egypt and Palestine and secures control over Judah. So think 605 BC, okay? So at this time, there's a guy named Jehoiakim. He's mentioned in the Bible, and he's king over Judah at the time, okay? So in 598, Nebuchadnezzar runs the area, and of course Jehoiakim is his kind of puppet or his king. Now he's actually the king that the Jews recognize is the right one from the line of David. Okay, so they held him as the accurate king. He should be the king. Not necessarily a great guy, though. Okay? He ends up rebelling against Nebuchadnezzar in 598, and so Nebuchadnezzar executes him and puts his son on the throne. And his name is Jehoiachin. Okay? Jehoiachin, kind of crazy names. He's going to change his name, though. Okay? 588 to 586. So Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, and he leaves only the poor behind, the very poor behind. Okay, so there's actually a time, kind of a break here, where you have an initial takeover of the area. There's some deportation that goes on. And then you have rebellion, and there's some deportation that goes on. Okay, before he actually comes in and wipes it out. There's kind of, I want to call it like a three-wave piece to this. He didn't just come in and take them all and they leave in one shot. He came in, took the area over, took a few, left some, made his own king, said, you're going to run the area for me, but I'll leave the Jews here, some of them. And then they would rebel, and so what would he do? He'd come in and he'd destroy the rebellion, and he would take more out, put a new person in. Okay, that's kind of the way he ran through this. So in 588 to 586, that's when ultimately he goes in and says, okay, I can't seem to get anybody to follow what I want to do, so we're going to just They destroy the temple, they destroy the city, and they basically take as many people as they can out, and they only leave the super poor back to just try to figure out how to survive amongst the ruins. Okay? That's the end of that process. So I think 605 to 586, you're almost a 10-year, 20-year period here where you're looking at them being exiled. It wasn't just here comes Nebuchadnezzar in one time and then they're gone. Okay? So you have to keep that in mind. So 598, 597, Jehoiachin, okay, he's the guy that Jehoiakim gets killed, executed by Nebuchadnezzar. He puts his son in there and he says, okay, I'm not willing to submit either. And so Nebuchadnezzar actually decides to take out a bunch of the nobles and the priests, and he takes the treasures from the temple. Okay, remember those show up later on, and takes them to Babylon. And he takes a bunch of Jews at that time, and he puts them near Nippur by the Chebar Canal. Now, why is that important for our study? That's Ezekiel. So you can see there's been some uprisings before Ezekiel gets taken out. Okay, and he gets taken out probably in this, I want to call it maybe like a second wave kind of before the destruction. We haven't even got to the destruction of Jerusalem yet. Temple is technically still standing, and he's in exile at Nippur. Okay, so in the middle of that, he's in that group. Okay, so you can kind of get here's a little bit of a better map, and you can see here where the Chebar Canal is, right around in here, and they had a settlement of the Jewish people they had brought in. It's not necessarily right by Babylon. It's actually closer to Nippur than it is to Babylon. Okay, they're kind of on the outside of the area. Okay, that's where they put them. Notice this in Psalm 137. It says, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat. Yes, we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows in her midst we hung up our lyres, for there our captors asked us words of a song, and our tormentors asked us jubilation. Sing for us from a song of Zion." How can we sing the song of Yahweh in a foreign land? So a psalm written of lament, basically talking about what? We're by a river in Babylon. It's probably this settlement by the Chebar Canal. You have these Jews here who got exiled, and they're sitting there. And what are their captors saying? Entertain us, Jeremiah 29 says, "Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have deported from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, and plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and father sons and daughters, and take for your sons wives. Give your daughters to men, that they may bear sons and daughters and multiply there. And you must not be few. And seek the prosperity of the city where I have deported you, and pray on behalf of it to Yahweh, for in its prosperity you will have prosperity." So what's the instruction that the Jews get from Jeremiah? Settle in and make the city prosperous. Use your skills and ability, because if you prosper the city, you're going to prosper too. And there's records, there's one particular, the name escapes me, but of a particular Jewish household that was known in Babylon, and they were really good in finance, and they had a lot of involvement in the banks of Babylon and different things. And so it wasn't like they came there and they were in prison cells. Okay, they were deported there, and the idea was we need to scrub out the Jewishness of them and turn them into what? Babylonian. Assimilate them to our culture. And so that was the idea. And that's what a lot of these ancients did. They would go in and they would say, we're going to assimilate, the groups that we take over. We try to destroy their culture, essentially, so they can be part of that. So that's what's going on with Ezekiel. When they bring these guys in, they put them there and they park them there for that purpose. Okay? So I want you to keep this in mind. At the time Ezekiel is taken to Babylon, Jerusalem and the temple are still standing. Okay? In fact, when he's getting visions, it hasn't even been destroyed yet. A lot of times we think when we read Ezekiel, they're exiled. That means Jerusalem's destroyed, the temple's gone, there's nobody there, it's just a desolate wasteland. That's not true. It does happen later on, but not when Ezekiel is deported and when he starts receiving his visions. Okay? There's still people living there, and they're wondering what's going to happen. What's going on with Jerusalem? Is this place going to be restored? When are we going to get our life back? They're wondering these things. Okay? So I want you to keep that in mind as we're going forward, because we go through a lot of these visions and these different things. You got to keep in mind what's happening in Jerusalem, because what does he have a lot of visions about? What's going to happen in Jerusalem, okay? Ezekiel has visions of the temple and events associated with its destruction, which came after he was in Babylon. So I want you to just keep that in mind. We talked about this a little bit. There were multiple rebellions and deportations in Judah before Jerusalem was besieged. We just usually think of one. They got them all, they left, they took them out, and they're gone. No, that's not how it worked. He tried to put people in place, Nebuchadnezzar did, that would basically rule under his hand. And if they didn't, he would go in and remove them, maybe take some of the people out, and put somebody else in there. That's kind of how he operated, okay? He was what I was calling the second wave. Ezekiel was in that second wave of people, okay? Now, Zedekiah was the king in Jerusalem after the time Ezekiel was taken to Babylon. So these guys end up getting removed, okay? And what happens? Jehoiachin, and they all get actually taken to Babylon, and he gets put in jail. And he ends up becoming actually kind of higher up or becoming a part of the ruling class in Babylon, okay? Even though he was the king of Israel. But Zedekiah becomes the king in Jerusalem after the time Ezekiel's taken to Babylon. He actually ultimately rebelled. Surprise, surprise, right? That's kind of the theme of Israel kings, right? They rebelled, and he was brought before Nebuchadnezzar, so they went in and they basically said, okay, we got another problem here. Let's go get this guy. They got him. They took him to where Nebuchadnezzar was. They made him watch his sons be executed, and then they gouged his eyes out. So Nebuchadnezzar was not a nice guy. Well, at least not with the people that rebelled against him. Okay, and so not a good situation. At this time is when they went in and said it's over, wiped the place out, left the super poor, took the rest of the exiles into Babylon, and he was done with Israel at that point. Done with Jerusalem. Temples destroyed, cities sieged. It's over. Okay. So that's the world that's going on at the time of Ezekiel. The temple's still standing. The city's still standing. It's not great what's going on. There's some have been deported. And here's Ezekiel by the Chebar Canal with a group of Jews that have been set there. And they're wondering what's going on with Jerusalem because you couldn't get on your iPhone. And you couldn't get on the news, right? Say, well, let's see if it's still standing. Let's see if you didn't know any of that. You knew that they would come, but we don't know what's happening. And so that makes his visions even more important because people are wondering what's going on. So let's talk about him as a person because he's kind of an interesting guy, Ezekiel. Who was he? Well, we know he was a prophet, right? So you can't use that one. But we actually don't know much about him outside his own book. It's really odd that he doesn't get a lot of attention by anybody else. There's only one other person named Ezekiel, and that's in Numbers, and it's not necessarily related to this one. So we don't even have a lot of Ezekiels that show up. There's his name in Hebrew. Good luck with that one, right? If you wanted to see it in Hebrew, it's actually really closely connected to the name Hezekiah, who was a king of Israel. They basically both have a tie into God strengthens or God is my strength. And so Ezekiel's name literally means God strengthens or toughens. Now, he goes through the ringer, so I could see how that might have been something that he was about to experience. Hezekiah means Yahweh has strengthened. So there's kind of with the language, they're just a similar name. He was a priest. Okay, we're going to talk about more of that in a second. His dad was a priest. Okay, kind of runs in the family. In fact, Ezekiel 1:1-3, here's what it says. And it was in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, and I was in the midst of the exiles by the Chebar River. The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of the king Jehoiachin. The word of Yahweh came clearly to Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, the priest, in the land of the Chaldeans at the Chebar River, and the hand of Yahweh was on him there. First thing out of the book gives us these dates and tells us that kind of sets it up, right, of what's going to happen. So Ezekiel's dad was a priest. We know that from that text. His name was Buzi, okay? He was a priest. Now Ezekiel, well, yeah, I know, would have named Buzi, right? You wouldn't name your kid that today, for sure. Buzi. So Ezekiel's dad's a priest, but Ezekiel isn't a priest yet. When he gets exiled, he's actually not a priest yet. He's in the priestly line, but he's not officially been declared the priest before he gets exiled. In fact, I don't think he ever actually gets declared officially the priest, which is kind of tough for them, right? How would you like to be Ezekiel? You go through all the classes, and then the time comes and they basically are like, sorry, we're being invaded, you're never going to get there, right? He actually expresses throughout his book a very deep understanding of not only the systems in Judaism, sacrifice, different ways they would do things. He understands the temple layout really, really well. And so you can kind of see that he probably had some experience with the priests and in the temple. He kind of shows that. I always say he was a church kid. Dad was a priest. Guess where he probably grew up? In the church. So he knew how it worked. He knew how things operated. He knew the layout of the temple. And why would this be important? Considering what's coming to him. What does he get visions of? The temple, all these different things. And it probably is like, yes, I understand, because he shows that very much in his writing. Okay, he was married. Did you know that? This is kind of crazy. We're going to spend some time on this when we get there. It's a little ways away. But his wife would actually later die, and it says, by the hand of Yahweh. And Ezekiel is told by God, you cannot mourn for her. We're going to talk about that later, because it's one of these really weird things that happens with Ezekiel that it's hard to explain. But yes, he did have a wife, and she did die. There's been a lot of questions when you look at Ezekiel from like a psychology angle. I've actually read some psychologists who are, I would say they're definitely not Christians, but he's been through a lot of evaluation, okay? And most of them will say he's a psycho, okay? I'm just summing it up, okay? Schizophrenic, he's got some problems with a number of these things. So from a worldly standpoint, they have basically called him nuts. And from a biblical standpoint, we go, well, it's like he is living out what God is doing elsewhere. He becomes the actual living example of what's happening in his ministry and what he's prophesying. So he kind of had to experience it. So he's been evaluated a lot by the psychological community. It didn't come out real well for him. Okay, he's extremely strange in his behavior. In fact, of all the prophets, he's probably the most extreme in just what he does and how he does it. Okay. This is, I think, important. Some suggest that Ezekiel didn't just give signs, he became the sign. Okay? The stuff that his behavior suggests was what God is trying to get across to the people. It wasn't like he would go part the sea and that's it over there. He was it. And so God just put him through a lot of things to express what he was trying to get across. Statements made by the initial calling or vision of Ezekiel have led some to believe that he actually resisted the call initially. He gets told many times, do this, and then he gets told again, do it, and then he kind of gets warned like, hey, if you don't do it, the blood's on your hands. And so there's kind of some questions of, was Ezekiel like, no. Have we ever seen that before? Moses, Jonah. I mean, they kind of have a way of being like, please no, Isaiah, who's going to go for us? Hey, send me. Now, that's not necessarily some of these guys, right? They resisted it. So without falling into apostasy, was Ezekiel still some degree a product of his culture, do you think? I mean, he's not obviously falling into idolatry. He still serves Yahweh. But you have to think of the world that he's in, the culture he's in, right? It's not a good one. It's definitely become very pagan. That's the reason they're being exiled, right? Judgment. And so you wonder if he's going, I don't really know if I want to have to do this. I don't know if I want to do this, right? Ezekiel uses language that's very sharp, okay? It's very direct, and it's actually even very offensive in many cases. Now, obviously, we're not going to look at it in the raw form. I'm going to sum it up for you on some of those. But it's been softened when you read your text. It's been softened because it's literally certain chapters you couldn't even read without blushing. It's borderline pornographic in some places when he's talking about Israel's adultery against God. Okay, we're not going to get into that, but I'm going to kind of walk you through general pieces so you kind of get it and you can take it at that. But if you read it in the original, it was meant to get people's attention. It was meant to literally be a shock factor to the Israelites who would read it. Okay. Ezekiel wanted to offend the audience so they would understand God's offended. This is how bad it is. Okay. He obviously has a number of messages. Many of his messages were given to the Jews in Babylon years before they happened in Jerusalem. So when he's having these visions, it's stuff that hasn't happened yet. We have a tendency to think he gets a vision of Jerusalem being knocked down or whatever it is. Oh, it's already been done. He's getting it before that's happened. Remember, It's not over in Jerusalem yet. They haven't finished the conquest of taking and knocking the city down. And he's in exile, okay? He actually shows at one point he's like playing with stuff in the dirt, and he's making like siege ramps, and he's kind of playing with his toys. I know it's really weird. But he's doing that, and it's like a siege against Jerusalem. And people are probably looking at him like, what is he doing? He's lost it, right? And it's a way of him saying, here's what's happening. Here's what's coming. And it was before it actually took place in Jerusalem, okay? Now, here's just some interesting facts. Ezekiel isn't mentioned by any other person in the Old Testament. That's kind of weird, right? He's not mentioned by anyone in the New Testament, but referred to by John in the book of Revelation. We talked about that. He uses the term Gog, Magog, and a lot of his end time stuff matches what Ezekiel talks about. But there's actually no mention of his name in the New Testament. So, did they think he was crazy? I don't know. Probably not. He obviously made it into the Bible. Jeremiah and Daniel were contemporaries of him. Jeremiah's kind of before the siege is coming, before the exile. Daniel obviously ends up in Babylon, right? So they're all kind of side by side going through this together. The Jewish historian Josephus. Who's Josephus? You guys know who Josephus is? Jewish historian, yes. Yep. He kind of has a history. He did, yeah, I like that. He did not give in to the Romans, and so he was, instead of committing suicide, he surrendered, and then he ended up becoming this writer, and he has this books, The Antiquities of the Jews, where he records all this stuff. He actually states that Ezekiel had 2 books that he wrote.
Josephus was New Testament times?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So he's kind of in that this would have been probably about the time, maybe Apocrypha time, so between Old and New, Maccabees, that kind of stuff. They get taken, and he becomes this historian. He actually writes about Jesus. You know, he's one of the very few writers who, not a Christian guy, Jewish, but he records information about Jesus and the miracles that he did. Okay, but he actually says that there was Jews that thought he had 2 books. Okay, and it's actually not part of what we would have in our Bible, but there's fragments that they found, and they called it the Apocryphon of Ezekiel. Okay, not something we would hold as canon because we don't have original roots in that. It does not go all the way back, and it's not part of the Torah, so that's why it doesn't make it. Didn't make the cut. Okay, there was just not enough goodness, to it when it comes to how it connects. No one quotes it in the New Testament, right? So we just, this is not going to make the cut. So it did not make the cut. Okay. There's only 4 fragments they found of it, but it actually has a pretty detailed doctrine of resurrection, ironically. So use your imagination if you think it should be in there or not. Okay, back to Ezekiel 1 through 3. So there's a few things I want you to just grab on this as we look at it. Okay, it was the 30th year of the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month. I was in the midst of the exiles by the Kibar Canal. He talks about the heavens opening, okay, and he sees God. And then it says, on the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of Yahweh came clearly to Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, the priest, in the land of the Chaldeans at the Kibar River. So there's kind of these 2 things that's happening, okay? There's kind of some interesting dates. If you notice, we get 2 kind of separated dates in here. Like maybe it's stated twice, but there's kind of some unique things about this. What jumps out at you about the different statements here in verse 1 and verse 2? Kind of dated different, obviously. What else? Anything else? How are they written? You have one in first person. What does he say? So 30th year in the 4th month, and I. But then in verse 2 it says the third person, and it goes to Ezekiel, the son of Buzi. Kind of a weird beginning, right? So what does that tell us about the book? He jumps around. Does he talk to him? Says he one of these weirdos who just talks to himself in the third person? Yeah. Editing hand, right? So this shows signs of someone editing. Now Ezekiel's unique because he does do a lot of writing. I saw, I did, and so it's like he did his autobiography. But the idea is, and this is what some scholars think, is that some later on came and said it's so hard to understand because of Ezekiel's kind of way of doing this and his personal touch on it, as I'm seeing it, that they came in and felt it needed to be clarified. So, question is, it was the 30th year of what? Of what? And so what does an editor come in and do? How do we explain this? How is it people going to read this and not, if you're not Ezekiel, how are you going to know what he's talking about? And so the idea is that there was an editing hand that might have come in and helped clarify some of this. Maybe they were sitting with Ezekiel. That's the idea. It appears to be written by him, shows signs of an editor. The first person to third person switch is just notorious to show that. I'm talking about myself, and then maybe he wrote it down and handed it to somebody. That's what they would do sometimes. And then that person would take it and they would say, I'm going to preserve this, but then in order to pass it on, they're like, this isn't going to make any sense if I don't make a note here. And so that they would adjust it. What does Ezekiel mean by this, by in the 30th year? It's kind of a weird statement to make. 30th year of what is kind of what I was asking. What's he talking about here? Now look at this. This might give us some insight into what he's talking about. Because remember, if it's a personal writing by Ezekiel writing, he doesn't have to explain the event that starts whatever this 30th year is, right? Because he's just writing down his own thoughts. He's not writing it so that I can write it to you so you know what the 30th year is. And so there's been a lot of speculation of what is this time frame. So here's Numbers 40. It says, for those 30 years old and above until 50 years old, you will muster them all who come to do the work of the tent of assembly. What's he talking about here in Numbers? The priesthood. What age do you have to be before you're prepared to be a priest? Before you can be officially a priest? 30. Is there a connection? What's Ezekiel doing? Okay, he's not a priest yet. He didn't make it there. He wasn't officially the priest. But it says here in his, in the text, it was the 30th year. But where's he at on his 30th year? His 30th birthday, where did he spend it? In Babylon. And so what happens from God's perspective, maybe he is about to get officially called the priest. And he's even old enough now to officially be the priest. Some have speculated maybe that's what he's talking about here. He may be thinking of a personal event that stood out to him. The 30th year, it was the year that I was officially old enough to be the priest, is when the vision came to me. Which would make sense, right? Could be related to the date that he officially became the priest. Verse 2. So we look, that's kind of verse 1. What about this one? On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. The word of Yahweh came clearly to Ezekiel. So you have another time frame given, okay? Is this clarification of the 30th year maybe from a more like everybody can understand this because we know when Jehoiachin the king was taken and it was this many years and this date and this month? That's probably what's going on with this. Based on the information provided, you can actually get it dated directly to the 5th day of Tammuz in 593 BC, which if you took it to our time, it's July 31st, 593 BC. Very specific. We can't really get there very specifically unless we have that editorial mark from the third person. I think that may be why it's there. So people can know this is when this happened. Helps kind of line it up with the time. Okay? Ezekiel 1:4. Suddenly I noticed a stormy wind blowing in from the north, an enormous cloud with fire flashing back and forth and a radiance surrounding it, and the sparkle of amber issued forth from it from the heart of the fire. So this is what he sees when he's standing. Now we don't know if he was actually standing by the actual canal. Like I always envisioned him as a kid standing like on the beach or like on the shore, like on the bank and going, "Oh, what is that?" Or was he just in the settlement there by, what's the relation to that? What did you guys say? Do you think he's standing by the river? Did you envision him standing outside by like a little canal running by, or did you envision him, he's just among the Jews settled by this, and maybe he's in his house? Maybe he's out in the backyard. I don't know. We don't know for sure. But he obviously notices a stormy wind blowing in from the north. Now, do you remember, those of you who are in the Ezekiel 38 and 39 thing, the north, what was the significance of the north? Okay, it was where Zaphon was. It also became, when we talked about the Mount of Assembly, it became another name for Mount of Assembly in the Yarkit Zaphon in the far north, even though it's talking about vertical. Where's God at? Okay, not necessarily there. And so he sees this stormy wind blowing in from the Zaphon, from the north. Okay. Storm wind was coming from the north, a great cloud. Now, north of Israel, we talked about this when we did Ezekiel 38 and 39, is that Mount Zaphon, which was believed to be the home of Baal, who was the pagan understanding of the storm god. Now, think of that in light of this now. What's coming? A stormy wind is blowing in from where? The north. Okay? Now, is there meaning to that?
You think it was evil coming.
It sounds like it. But you remember that when we went through the whole Mount of Assembly and Isaiah's talking about you wanted to get to the top of the Mount of Assembly in the Yarkit Saphon in the farthest parts of the north. It was about him trying to usurp, or Satan or the king of Babylon trying to usurp Yahweh, right? But here comes from the north, not somebody to usurp him, but Yahweh himself. Who is the king of the north? The real one. The ultimate authority. The highest authority. It's not Baal. It's not Baal, is it? There's much conflict between the Israelites and the pagan neighbors who lived to the north. Did they not get exiled because of their involvement with Baal? And who is the storm god? Interesting. Ezekiel makes it clear that Yahweh is the Most High and He is the true God who controls the storm. Okay? There's this thing that's come out of this. This happens all through the Bible, but I'm just going to give you a quick, brief touch on it. It's called a storm theophany. What is the theophany? Anybody know? An appearance of God. Okay? It's an appearance of God. So, a storm theophany would be the appearance of God through a storm. Do we see that in the Bible? Have you ever read the Old Testament? There's a lot of that, isn't there? Great cloud flashing and fire flashing back and forth and brightness all around and within it. Okay? You've got clouds. Would that be storm related? Yeah. You've got lightning. I would assume there probably was some thunder if you're seeing flashes of lightning, right? Look at Habakkuk. It says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, Saleh. His splendor covers the heavens, His praise fills the earth, and His brightness was like the light. Flashing rays came from His hand for Him, and there in the covering of His strength. Before Him went disease and pestilence went out at His feet. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. Sounds like thunder, maybe a little bit with the trembling. Remember when we've talked about this one before. You notice disease and pestilence are capitalized? Those are names of deities, Canaanite deities, Deber, Resheph. And so the idea is who's he pulling on a chain behind him? A band of destroying angels. Okay? They work for him. Okay? They don't go out on their own. They work for him. Okay? Like this in Exodus, this one will make sense. On the third day when it was morning, there was thunder and lightning. Where are they at? They're at Sinai. Okay? And a heavy cloud over the mountain, and a very loud ram's horn sounded, and all the people who were at the camp trembled, and Moses brought the people out from the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. So when they get to Sinai, what do they see happen? A storm comes down, clouds, thunder, lightning, all this stuff. It's the same kind of stuff Ezekiel's saying. Here's in verse 13. So God led the people around by the way of the desert. So I went back. This is when they're leaving Egypt. To the Red Sea, and the Israelites went up in battle array from the land of Egypt, and Yahweh was going before them by day in a column of cloud to lead them on the way, and by night in a column of fire to give light to them to go by day and night. The column of cloud by day and the column of fire by night did not depart from before the people. So when God was going before them, how did they see Him? Okay, you see the same. This is a storm theophany, the appearance of God through the storm, through the clouds, through the lightning, through the fire. Okay. Now, interestingly, let's see if you catch the difference on this one. Okay, just a little bit further on, Yahweh said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Speak to the Israelites so that they will set out. And you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it so the Israelites can go in the middle of the sea on the dry land." Then it says this. And the angel of God who was going before the camp of Israel set out and went behind them. And the column of clouds set out ahead of them, and it stood still behind them, so that it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. And it was a dark cloud, and it gave light to the night, so that neither approached the other all night. Did you catch the difference in this verse from the first one? It said God went before them in the cloud, in the pillar, right? But then who's going before him, and now who's moved behind him in this one? The angel. This is the two powers of heaven idea that the Jews are trying to figure out. Who's in the cloud? Is it Yahweh or is it an angel? The answer is yes. Is there an angel of the Lord, Yahweh in human form? We would know him by a different name. Okay. This might be an appearance of that in the Old Testament. Who's actually in the cloud? It's Yahweh. It's also an angel. In fact, at one point, as they're traveling, he tells the Israelites, I want you to follow and listen to that angel, because if you don't, he won't forgive your sins. Connection? 1 Kings, you're going to know this story briefly. Who's up on the mountain Carmel? Elijah's up there. He's got the prophets of who? Baal, ironically. And they have this contest. It says, then the fire of Yahweh fell, and it consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and the water, which was in the trench. It licked it up. When all the people saw, they fell on their face and said, Yahweh is God, Yahweh is God, he is God. Then Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, don't let any man of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the wadi of Kishon and killed them there. Hundreds of them. And what were they having? A contest on the top of a mountain to see which God would respond. And they're both, who's Baal known as? The storm god. Isn't it interesting, on top of a mountain saying, okay, who's going to get hit by lightning first, right? That's probably what it looked like. And then Elijah wins. It happened at the offering of the evening oblation, Elijah the prophet went near, and he said, O Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things by your words. Answer me, O Yahweh, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned your hearts back again, or turned their hearts back again. So what's he doing? He's saying, I'm going to call on the real God who controls the storms. Yahweh. And what does he do? He answers. Right? Magnificently. Now, I don't know if there's a connection here. This is where my mind goes. Great storm of wind developed. We're in the New Testament. The waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already being filled with water, and he was in the stern sleeping. Who's he? Jesus. He's in the stern sleeping on the cushion, and they woke him and said to him, Teacher, it is not a concern to you that we are perishing? And he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Be quiet, be still. And the wind abated, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, Why are you fearful? Do you not yet have faith? And they were terribly frightened and began to say to one another, Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Do you think there's theological messaging in Jesus allowing this to happen? Being in a boat when a storm shows up, and he goes out and basically tells the storm, calm down, and it does. What is he saying? Who controls the storm? He does. Now, if they're good Old Testament students, what are they going to remember? They're going to be a connection there, because they're going to go back and say, we have a God who controls the storm too. He showed up at Sinai and in the wilderness, and there's all this written about him. Think about Ezekiel, what he sees in his vision, and they're going, we have this guy who just claims to control the storm, and he did it. And he doesn't seem concerned when it's going on around him. He's just asleep. And why is that? Because he's in control of it. I'll just sleep through it. No, aren't you going to get up? We're going to die. Hey, quiet down. You can just imagine. Look at this in verse 14. When he gets in trouble, this is what gets him crucified ultimately. I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with what? That sounds like storm imagery. What's he saying? He's quoting Daniel. Here it is. I continued watching the visions of the night, and look, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all the peoples and nations and languages would serve him. His dominion is a dominion without end that will not cease, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. Who is he talking about? Who's the Son of Man that comes before the Ancient of Days? Yeah. They just don't have him named Jesus yet. But he's coming on the clouds. And so when Jesus knows all this, because he wrote it, essentially, and he tells the high priest, next time you see me, I'll be coming on the clouds of heaven. He's quoting Daniel 7. And they're like, blasphemy, we've heard it, now we can kill him. Kind of put the nail in his own coffin.
So,
Obviously, it wasn't going to stay shut, but
is there like a thunderstorm when Christ was on
there
the
is.
cross?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it get dark and all this stuff, you know. Yeah. So hopefully you're getting the concept that God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, and even Jesus has storm imagery that seems to be connected with him. The power of a storm is connected with the power of God. Okay? So when Ezekiel says, suddenly I noticed a stormy wind blowing in from the north. It's an enormous cloud, and there's fire. He can see fire in it. Now, what do you mean by that? Do they know it's lightning? Have they had Thomas Edison in the experiments? No, they just see the flashes. And so what are they thinking? Fire. He's probably seeing lightning, right? He sees a sparkle of amber coming from it, in the heart of it, like something glowing inside as it's coming. Goes on and says, and from its midst was the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance, a human form, and each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight legs, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of the foot of a calf. They were sparkling like the outward appearance of polished bronze. Isn't this weird? This is one of the weirdest descriptions that you get in the Bible. In fact, there's actually people that think he's describing a UFO. When you get into wheels and stuff, all the UFO people come out of the woodwork and they go, nope, Ezekiel saw a UFO. He did not see a UFO. Okay, if somebody tells you that, baloney. Okay, it's not a UFO. Goes on to say, and under their wings were human hands on their 4 sides, and their faces and their wings, for the 4 of them were as follows. Their wings were touching one another. Each of them went straight forward without turning right or left. The likeness of their faces was the face of a human in front, and the face of a lion on the right of each of them, the face of an ox on the left of each of them, and the face of an eagle for each of them. So were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward. Each had 2 touching one another, and 2 covering their bodies. What a weird thing he's seeing, right? What does Ezekiel call these things? Just living creatures. He doesn't really know. He kind of knows, but he calls them living creatures. Okay, and he kind of clarifies it later in his book. We'll see in a second. But remember, this is the first time he's experienced this. He's trying to get his head wrapped around what he just saw, right? So, what is he seeing? This is knowable. This isn't one of those like, oh, we don't know what it is. No, this is knowable. What is he actually seeing? He's seeing angels, okay? Well, I shouldn't say angels. Cherubim, okay? It's a class of angel. Cherubim, yeah. They are different. And he says that actually later in chapter 10. He calls them cherubim. When he gets another vision, he describes the same thing, and instead of calling them living creatures, he says the cherubim. So I don't know if something happened between 1 and 10 where it's like, and now I know what I saw, which we're going to walk through that here in just a second, okay? They're kind of weird creatures, aren't they? People have tried to draw these. I looked at pictures all week long. I didn't even bring one because they're just all over the board, okay? 4 faces. You got a human, a lion, an eagle, and an ox. That's weird, okay? It has human form, so there's like apparently a body with straight legs, and it's standing somewhat upright, it sounds like, okay? They have wings. 2 of them are kind of across, and 2 of them are out. Legs with a calf foot at the bottom, so they're bovine, feet, okay? Polished bronze appearance. Doesn't mean they were bronze. It means that they looked like it. They were sparkling, okay? Now, we got to have a little background so we can understand from Ezekiel's context. If God shows him this, is there something that would have... Okay, I think I know what we're looking at here, okay? There's a lot of sculptures and drawing in the ancient world that have a half animal, half human. Did you know that? A lot of the ancient civilizations drew these things, okay? Here's an example. You can kind of see, look at the legs, and then it's got like a human head on it, okay? You have this man with like some weird cat dragon body. I don't know what that's supposed to be, right? Lizard, maybe. This is one that you people typically recognize. What's the Sphinx supposed to be? Looks like a pharaoh head on like a lion's body, right? Big old paws laying out there. So it's common to have a mixture of animals and people in iconography when you see these sculptures and these monuments and things. Here's one. This one's actually got the face of a person. It's got wings, and it has like an animal body. Kind of a weird one, huh? This one's actually from, I think this one's actually from Babylon. This is a Babylonian image. These beings were understood to be guardians of the deity. All the cultures shared this, where they had these beings that looked in similar ways like this, but they were throne guardians. The idea was you didn't enter sacred space unless you got through these things. And these things' job was to do what? Keep the sacred space sacred. Nothing enters here that's not authorized. Okay? Now I want you to think back to Genesis. Adam and Eve get kicked out. What happens? Yeah, they get kicked out, and God says, you can't go back there. And so what does he do? He puts an angel with a flaming sword standing at the entrance. And what's it doing? Guarding sacred space. And you're not the sacred space anymore. You had to leave. So this thing is keeping you out. So those are very well known, and they're imaged a specific way in the ancient world with this half human, half being. So the living beings seen by Ezekiel were not unknown to the Israelites or the Babylonians. We're thinking about like, this is foreign to us. We have no idea what he's seeing. They understood exactly what he was seeing, because they have images of this stuff all over the place. Okay? Ezekiel actually, in chapter 10, I mentioned this, identifies these living beings as cherubim. He changes the language a little bit, and you're going, okay, did he get some new information, or did he go, oh, I think I know what I just saw finally. He's in shock at the first writing. So let's talk about a cherubim for a second. It originates from Akkadian, caribou, and it's a guardian. That's what it means. Guardian, throne guardian. The Assyrian equivalent was depicted with a combination of lions, bulls, and humans. Well, we kind of have some of that stuff in this one, don't we? So this is not foreign to the ancient world. That's what I'm trying to get you to understand, is it's foreign to us, was not foreign to them. They knew exactly what this was. So what's with these four faces? Okay, you've got the human, you've got the lion, you've got the eagle, you got the ox. What in the world does this mean? What's God trying to relay to Ezekiel with these things? Let's talk about the lion. Does this have any significance with God? Yeah, I mean, Jesus gets called the lion from the tribe of Judah, right? Hosea 11:10 says this, they will go after Yahweh. He roars like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the sea. Does God get identified with lion imagery? Why? Because that's like the king of the beasts, right? I mean, you're talking about nothing stronger than the lion. The lion represented that royalty, right? The lion was associated with the strength and royalty in the ancient world. So if you wanted to be a king and make a monument for yourself, what would they do? They'd put their head on a lion's body. Royalty, strength, okay? What about the eagle? Exodus 19:4, this is an interesting verse. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I bore you on eagle's wings and I brought you to me. Look at Psalm 91. With his feathers he will cover you, and under his wings you can take refuge. Is that bird imagery? Eagle imagery? It is. So what's the eagle association? Swiftness. Can be here to there, like that, quickly. Okay? Obviously an eagle's a powerful bird. I mean, what's United States' bird? The eagle, right? What about the ox? Well, here's Proverbs 14:4. When there are no oxen, the manger is empty, but an abundance of crops comes from the strength of an ox. From their culture, was an ox important? Why? It was strong, but it was so strong, it was so important for agriculture. If you wanted to have a harvest, you needed oxen, right? The ox represented strength and fertility, and also the creative nature of things. Fertility, creation is kind of what they were represented by. What about the human? Oh, this one's a weird one. Genesis 1:27, so God created humankind in his image, in the likeness of God he created him. So what's the human connection? Better than another three. This is the representation of the likeness of God in a fleshly form. But you know what it means in the ancient world is wisdom and intelligence. We're smarter than animals. We're the top of the food chain. We're the glory, ultimately, of God's creation. We're the great thing he created, the capstone piece. So you have all four of these. Okay, now I want to show you this. This is actually a Babylonian. There's actually a gate that you can go in, where they've preserved it, called the Ishtar Gate. And when you go in, this is all over it. This is Babylonian. And what do you see here? It's a lion, but it has wings on it. It's just one example of how they would take these things. And what's Nebuchadnezzar saying when he puts this all over everything? The swiftness and strength that he has created in this image. Okay, so when God says, I have these things, that we're not even talking about Yahweh yet. We're just talking about these things, that these living creatures that Ezekiel sees. And what do they see? What does he see? All these weird faces, things with wings. Strange, right? Now here's another angle to just think about, okay? The faces represent the 4 cardinal points. North, south, east, west. Okay, you have 4 faces. Okay? What would that be if that was the case? If they represented just the 4 cardinal points, what would that be the messaging, do you think, to Ezekiel?
He sees everything.
Yeah, there's no area on the 4 corners of this earth that I don't control. I am everywhere, I can be anywhere, and it's all mine. Okay? The corners of the earth. It's been noted that Hebrew symbolism held that the 4 corners of the earth represented these cardinal points. Okay? Those were the areas of the earth in their mind. Now, I know this sounds weird, but in ancient astrology, which was heavy in Babylonian culture, the bull represented the spring equinox, Taurus, when you looked up into the sky. Leo, the lion, was the summer solstice. Aquila, the eagle, represented the autumn equinox, and the human, Aquarius, represented the winter solstice. The 4 seasons. Is there a connection that God is saying, not only am I these 4 images that you've seen understood by your culture, strength, swiftness, and so on, but I control all of nature. The whole earth is mine. The world is mine. Ironically, Aquarius is the only man in the constellations. So it's not like they just grabbed one. There's only one. Ironically, also, the 4 points of the Hebrew year were represented in the images found on the synagogue floor. They were the same kind of images that we just saw, or what we just looked at. They kind of had some iconography they put on their floor of what the 4 corners of the earth were. Look at what he says in Ezekiel 10. So I just skipped a bunch of chapters, but it's comparative, so we need to look at it. He gets this vision again. He says, each one had 4 faces. The face of the one was the face of a cherub. Okay, now he's revealed his hand a little. And the face of the second was the face of a human. The face of the third was the face of a lion. And the fourth was the face of an eagle. What did he change? He changed something. There's no ox now. Did he see something that he kind of thought was an ox? And then when he kind of got the second vision, he's like, that's not an ox. Now I know what that is. That's a cherub. And he knows it because of the culture he lives in, the world he lives in. It's not an ox, it's a cherubim. Because he's seen images of it. If you follow the order and you switch the cherubim with the ox, because that's what he swapped out, it would be the exact clockwise around the directional points. Just goes like this. He didn't just go like this. He actually went around the 4 cardinal points in clockwise order. There's been some scholars that have seen that as a way of him saying, what we're trying to relay to you is that God controls the 4 corners of the earth. That he is all-knowing, he is everywhere, all-seeing, and these 4-faced beings can get him anywhere he wants at any time because it's all in his ability. It's just something I thought was kind of interesting. Yeah. So this is all the stuff we just went through. This is just from this week. So if you want to look up some of the stuff, I'll put this on the recording. But these are the resources that I use to just do this stuff. Okay, and I'm going to try to do these every week. So if you want to go check them out, you can. But there's a lot of stuff in there, and we're going to get into the beings again next week because we're not done by any means with these creatures. Okay, and what he's actually seeing. But I want to try to give you some contextual insight so you can kind of get in Ezekiel's head a little bit and go, what is he actually seeing and what does it mean? Okay? Questions? Comments? Thoughts?
I have to go back to Babylon. There was the lion with the wings.
Mm-hmm.
I did out of it also with the eagle involved. The pagan worship goes fast throughout the whole world.
Yeah, it's true.
I don't know if I'm way off base. I don't know.
I think there's a connection there because, when you think of Babylonians going out and they had these banners by which they operated, they were pagans. If people assimilated to their culture in other nations, yeah, they were probably spreading that, and so it represented also their divinity and what they believed to be divine and their deities. So yeah, I think there's absolutely some things to go with that. Yeah, absolutely. What else jumped out? Anything? Go ahead, Alex.
So something for me that's extremely fascinating is is these creatures were made to guard. So if he's seeing this for this vision, what would these creatures be watching over? You know,
Yeah.
whether it's spirits of man or what? I mean, but they were built to guard something.
Yeah. I think that the concept of, I mean, if you think about this question, does God really need guarding?
No.
Does God really need angels? Does he need humans to do anything? No. But so ironically, I don't even know that, I think they're guardian beings
Yeah.
that are there to reflect what would have been understood of the royalty and the sacredness of where God sits, the throne in which he resides in. Does he need cherubim? No, he doesn't. Do they oversee stuff? I think maybe, but I do think it's more about God saying, I'm going to put an image out there of something when I show this to you, that you're going to know exactly how serious I am, about who I am, where I stand, and what I have beneath me. And I don't even know that they actually had to do anything. But in the ancient world, if you're Egyptian or you're from one of these cultures and you go put a cherub out front, what are you believing? That this being is going to keep what should be out and keep what's in, and it's going to keep and be that buffer. Does God need that? No, he can just keep anything out. But he still wants to represent that so that people understand from their worldly understanding of their context and their worldview what and who he is. I think that's really the idea, is that these are the weirdest looking creatures you can imagine, right? Four-faced things, and they look strange. And there's a lot of messaging in that. There's a lot of, here's what I'm trying to tell you. Are these things real? Apparently they are, because Ezekiel's seeing them. But you're going to see this show up as we get into it. I'll tip my hand a little bit for next week, because what you end up getting when you look at this is you get this throne chariot is essentially what he's seeing. And he's trying to make sense of it because it's very different. But this throne chariot thing he's seeing is not unknown in the ancient world. They had these where they would transport idols for deities and kings on them. And they would move them around, and they would have these icons and these beings on the bases in order to make it a sacred, holy place that's guarded by sacred, divine beings to keep it safe. I don't think God needed any of that, but he apparently likes to say, you guys got your stuff from somewhere.
Well, I think of the, he talked about the living creatures. Well,
Yeah.
in Revelation, you see the living creatures around.
Yeah. And you think about ancient culture, some of this stuff, there's a lot of similarities along all the cultures. It doesn't mean that they all believe the same thing, right? But it's weird how you see stuff, Sphinxes here, and you see stuff, Babylonians here, and Assyrians here. Did they all come, get this idea from somewhere? It would seem to be, right? Well, that makes sense when you think of the biblical narrative, because if you go back far enough, you all come from the same spot. And if God had revealed himself in the garden to Adam and Eve, and they had knowledge, and they lived hundreds and hundreds of years, and passed that information on, it would make sense where maybe these things started at one point, and they kind of got expanded and changed. And so I always think of the verses that talk about in Hebrews when it's talking about the temple and the tent on the earth. It's a reflection it's a shadow of the real things. And I think what Ezekiel is seeing is what came first. The actual things that were there, maybe even in the garden. And everybody has drawn on that over the course of human history, and they've created their own things, not like they should have. They should not have, right? But you even have in Ezekiel, we get there later, it talks about Eden, when we get to the Eden verses, and it even says, you were in the garden, a guardian cherub. And we always apply that to Satan, that he's talking about Satan being a guardian cherub in the Garden of Eden. So there must have been some angelic host there that human beings, Adam and Eve specifically, were familiar enough with that they could understand it, they could see it, and they had a hierarchy that they were able to grasp. They just got kicked out of that. I think that's where a lot of this has come from, this iconography that we see, is people are taking what's been passed down to them for years and years and years, but God is saying, let me show you where I'm at. And I'm separate from you. I have guarded. You don't come in. Does that change the perspective when you think about a New Testament where God says, I want you to come into the throne room with confidence by the blood of the Lamb? You can walk right in. See, in their world, you don't go into the deity's throne room, especially because you got to get by these guardians. Well, now these guardians are saying he's authorized, she's authorized. And how are you authorized? Not because of what you did, but because your blood has, the blood of Christ has paid for your sin, and now you are sacred space. Come on in. Let's have a conversation. Unheard of in the ancient world. But that's how God operated.